Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the collaboration album between Franz Ferdinand and Sparks, titled FFS. I've talked a little bit about artistic team-ups before on this series when two distinctive groups merge together to create a distinctly unique musical project. Sometimes the clash between the bands becomes the underlying arc of the album, like the stunning performance arts collaboration between Savages and Bo Ningen last year with Words to the Blind. More commonly, one act tends to eclipse the other, especially when the styles of the two bands kind of overlap. And with rare exception, that tends to be the older, more experienced act that takes more dominance. So on some level, when I heard about the planned collaboration between acclaimed genre-bending cult band Sparks and indie rock group Franz Ferdinand, it almost seemed too obvious. I mean, Sparks had been a player in the first wave of glam, disco, and synthpop. Franz Ferdinand had been one of the main frontrunners during the indie rock revival of the genres in the mid-2000s. Both featured frontmen who had a knack for overwritten, too clever by half lyricism that was always a little bit too hyperbolic and ridiculous for its own good, and yet still managed to maintain all of its cool, at least most of the time. Now, Sparks has done everything as an act out from changing genres about 8 different times to releasing full-on rock operas, and while the quality has been wildly uneven depending on the era, they've got nothing to prove at this point. Hell, when Franz Ferdinand approached Sparks about this idea a decade ago, Sparks frontman Ron Mail sent Franz Ferdinand a demo titled Piss Off, which hilariously turns up on this album. But a decade later, with Franz Ferdinand maturing as a band and Sparks not having dropped any new material in about 6 years, they joined together into the supergroup FFS and dropped a self-titled record. And really, why not? For Sparks, it's a shot to introduce themselves to an audience who might never have heard of them, especially given the massive discography going back to the beginning of the 70s. And as for Franz Ferdinand, it's a chance to work with longtime veterans and personal heroes and give them a chance to an excuse to get weird again. And while I absolutely adored Right Thoughts, Right Words, Right Action, which totally holds up, by the way, is one of my favorite records of 2013, bar none, Sparks might be able to add a little bit more focus to Franz Ferdinand's off-kilter experimentation, which can sometimes go off the rails. So, did FFS deliver? Well, it delivered something, but for the past week of trying to listen through and understand this album, I've been struggling to figure out what that thing is, because the self-titled record of FFS, it's a weird animal, and one I think that I appreciate a lot more than I like. For one, it's more of a Sparks affair than Franz Ferdinand's, and while it gives the older cult band a thicker sound, it doesn't quite lend them the loose, off-kilter grooves that would match the too clever by half lyrics. In other words, it's an oddly stiff and kind of pompous record that doesn't quite make the best of Franz Ferdinand's contributions instrumentally and leaves me feeling just a little bit vaguely unsatisfied every time I listen through it. In other words, definitely a good album that I can appreciate and I can recommend, but not quite a great one, and I gotta admit that does disappoint me as a fan of both Franz Ferdinand and Sparks. So the best way to approach this review is discussing the balance between Franz Ferdinand and Sparks, namely that there isn't any. This is an album that's most dominated by Mail's crisp, slightly askew keyboard lines that teeter on the edge of instability, and that means that the majority of Franz Ferdinand's instrumentation, from the weedy guitars to the oddly muffled drums, they don't really have the same presence in the mix. Now, for the most part, this isn't exactly a bad thing. Both groups are skilled melodic composers, and the wide breadth of odd synth tones that they use prove that each song stays very starkly memorable. But I'm left wishing for most of this album that there could be more of a punchy, melodic groove to supplement some of the keyboards, instead of just fill in background texture, or at least add a little bit more rollicking flow to these songs. It doesn't help matters that so much of the synth tones that they're chosen fall into this very chintzy, weedy territory that when paired with painfully underweight drums and both frontmen singing in falsetto, it just feels painfully thin to me. A lot of flavor, but no real body to that flavor. Now, that's not saying that there aren't a groove here or there. A fair few songs get some real bass presence and some fuzzier low-end synths, and whenever you get orchestral stings or a sharper guitar presence, they often turn out to be some of the best moments on the album. But it's nowhere near potent enough to match the blatant artificiality of the spacier keyboards or the odd, oily, lo-fi filter that feels slathered all over most of the vocals. And on that note, the choice to prioritize Ron Mail's thinner range of the mix strikes me as the wrong choice, especially on an album that needs a lot more heft to it than it has. Now look, that's not saying that there aren't solid moments on this record. Again, thickening the galloping groove against the chintzy keyboards on Dictator Son, solid fit for a tyrannical vibe with delusions of pomp and grandeur and confronting the real world, as was the swaggering bounce of the groove of Man Without a Tan, with the backing male chorus easily making it one of the most stickiest and well-flowing hooks on the album, with the strings adding the perfect bombastic excess. Really dug it. And I loved how the cheery, parade-like melody and drums of the power couple were balanced against this ominous counter melody in the guitar guitars and how that borderline vintage pop piano of Piss Off broke into this ridiculously fun slice of pretty basic glam rock. Honestly, pretty great pop song. The two moments that surprised me the most, though in a good way, were the acoustic ballad Little Guy from the Suburbs, which with the delicately soft vocals and with some of the horns could have been a military tribute until you looked into the lyrics, or the ridiculously self-aware collaborations Don't Work. That includes spacey, smooth jazz, piano-driven musical theater, an acoustic interlude, and prog rock operatic bombast as Ron Mail and Alex Capranos take potshots at each other in a 7-minute monster of a song that's an absolute joy to behold. I love that track. On the other hand, the runny mess of Things I Won't Get, the buzzy shrillness of Police Encounters that feels like a sloppier version of Close Encounters from Franz Ferdinand's last album, and So Desu and tries to evoke a Technicolor Asian vibe with the shrill synth line, but that farty low-end synth and the choppy percussion way too high in the mix makes it a lot more grating than most J-pop will ever be. It's a tribute, I guess, but not a good one. But okay, fine. On some level, you always expect this sort of instrumental collaboration to stumble somewhat when you got both acts. What about the lyrics, which have always been the consistent high points of both Franz Ferdinand and Sparks' albums? Well, they're definitely solid. They're very well written in terms of the detail-rich, excellently framed, incredibly imaginative, and frequently insane way they kind of have to be. Mostly focusing on narrators that are delusional, entitled twits who are only just realizing their lives are careening out of control. This is an album rife with unearned pomp, ridiculous demands, and a creeping sense that everybody's in way over their heads. In other words, it's sort of the exact same stuff that characterized Franz Ferdinand's last record, Right Thoughts, Right Words, Right Action. Now, here's the tricky thing for this stuff to be gripping beyond just sheer cleverness for its own sake, which is often enough, is that it needs to maintain the balance between self-aware absurdity and enough grandiosity and pathos to suck in the audience regardless. Think about Trees and Animals from that last Franz Ferdinand album. It was a tale of a madman spiraling into a web of mirrors, but the groove was so good on that song, yet kind of wanted to go along for the ride anyways. On this album, it can be a little bit harder to really stick with that protagonist. It wasn't as fun, like on Johnny Delusional or Call Girl. Both are presented from the perspective of indulgent dudes who feel entitled to this girl's attention and get progressively creepier as the songs go on. Which, yeah, I get the self-awareness, I get the social commentary, but it doesn't really suck me in the same way. And then there's cases like Police Encounters and So Desu, which have such a thin handle on the actual stakes of the songs they just kinda lose me along the way. Interestingly written, but not enough beneath them. Or the faux sincerity that's kinda sappy on Things I Won't Get that's just kind of a weak song. Now, where this album actually gets interesting for me is where the Insight aims to go a little bit deeper, a little bit darker. I mentioned the lyrics on Little Guy from the Suburbs being subversive, and that's because I'm fairly certain that song is written from the perspective of a Front de Libération du Québec terrorist fighting for separating that province out from the rest of Canada like what happened back in the 70s. And yet that song plays him like a hapless dupe who ends up getting martyred for his cause. Yeah, it kind of works in that regard. Man Without a Tan plays it a little bit simpler in its takedown of the tan musclehead culture in comparison with the tanless smooth talker who's a little bit more intellectual, but I kind of liked how utterly homoerotic that song came across, speaking from that musclehead's perspective. Kind of good commentary there. The best moments, though, come on Collaborations Don't Work, where Franz Ferdinand and Sparks just hurl insults at each other for 7 minutes that collect way too well, but it's also clear that they're each other's own warped mirror image, how one will be in a couple years. It lightens the entire sting of the album. It really sums up a lot of the themes. It might spend the entire length taking the piss out of guys everywhere from every subculture, but they don't hesitate from including themselves in the mix, which does add a little bit of populism and kind of undercut some of the nastier elements. So okay, where do I fall on FFS as a debut album? Honestly, I could go either way. I'd like to see the supergroup continue to work together, as it is an inspired pairing. They work well together, but I suspect the balance of style wouldn't really pick up some of the more youthful elements of Franz Ferdinand's style that make them one of the more interesting indie rock groups still working around. If the production balance is a little bit more guitar heavy or the grooves are a little bit thicker, a little bit more rollicking presence, I'd probably like this album a lot more. But as it is, it's a 7 out of 10 for me, and definitely a recommendation if you're a fan of Sparks, but kind of a qualified recommendation if you're a fan of Franz Ferdinand, as their best elements really don't come into play. Otherwise, it's weird and smart enough that it definitely deserves your time, but don't blame me if you end up just wanting both these groups just to, piss off. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else coming up that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give it a listen. But keep in mind that on July 10th, I will be covering a record from 2014 that you guys want me to cover. Keep in mind, leave your suggestions in the comments, tag them with 2014, be it an album that I've already covered or a fresh one that I might have missed that year. And keep in mind, I am tracking if you're going to try and spam me here. Keep that in mind. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.